Hi, Sabaa. It is so good to see you again. Welcome to Creative Inspired Happy.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored.
It's actually really, I was thinking about we met over a decade ago. I remember it was 2014, and I think you were relatively new to the Bay Area at the time. We had a little writing community, and we all went to see Divergent. And that was the first movie in the
Yes.
theaters, and that was when I first met you. So I can't believe it's been that long, actually, because our careers have done so much in that time, and yet at the same time, it feels like maybe it was just 2 years ago.
Yeah, it feels very recent. And it's crazy how fast it passed very quickly.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, now you have accomplished so much, at least by like external measures. So, but first, I want to take everyone back in time, even before I met you, because we met when neither of us were published yet, but both of us had already gotten book deals and we were on the brink of being published. Your first book, An Ember in the Ashes, came out in 2015. My first book, The Crown's Game, came out in 2016. We met in 2014. But before that, how did you become a writer?
Well, I say that I sometimes tripped into this space, but that's not entirely accurate. I started telling stories when I was very young. I just didn't think that, and I wrote when I was very young. I wrote down my stories. I wrote a whole book when I was like 15. It was awful, of course, but I never thought that being a writer was an actual job. I think I kind of disassociated the name on the bottom of a book cover from the actual book. So it wasn't until I was in my late 20s that I was like, oh, I could actually do this as a job and I really like it and maybe I should try to do it. Um, and so at that time I was working as a copy editor at the Washington Post. And journalism was also something I kind of fell into because I sort of took it as an elective as a kid, and then it was a job I could do and earn money when I was in college. So I did it when I was in college, and then it ended up being a job because I applied for an internship and got it. So it worked out well, but that job led me to read all these stories about sort of these terrible things happening in the world. And I think like I worked at night, and I think reading all those stories at night kind of got into my head, and I kept thinking like, I wish I lived in a world where like I could fix these things. And so then I decided to write a world in which these problems of things like occupations and child soldiers and extrajudicial jailings and bombings and war, that these things could be fixed in fiction. I started to write a world in which that was possible, and that is what became An Ember in the Ashes.
And so that was actually the first book that you ever tried to write was An Ember in the Ashes, other than like the book when you wrote when you were a teenager.
Yeah, that was the first book I tried to write. Oh, wait, no, that's not
Wow.
entirely true. I'm sorry. That was the first fantasy book I tried to write. I actually tried to write a contemporary book before that, but I really failed at it. So it was a book based on my childhood, but I was trying to write it as like a 24-year-old or a 25-year-old and did not know what I was doing. So that was actually the first book I tried to write, but it was more like it was almost like a journal. It was less of a book and more of a journal. Whereas Ember was an actual, like, I had an idea, a full plan. I kind of knew where I was going. That was the actual first real, like, book I tried to write. So, if that makes sense.
And how long did it take you from starting to write Ember until you actually landed an agent and signed your book deal?
6 years.
So not an overnight success. And I think that that's a myth that a lot of people see. It's almost like Hollywood. We see an actor and actress for what we think is the first time, and it seems like they hit it big right out the gate, but there's so much work that happened before that.
That's right. Exactly.
So, one thing I think is really interesting about you, though, is that when you did finally get that book deal, it was a huge book deal. And I remember when I first met you, there was all this buzz like, who is this Sabaa person? Because we had already had this little community of aspiring writers in the Bay Area. And then here you came in and you had this like, huge announcement for your book deal. But you are the most humble person. And throughout all this time that I've known you, you've always been so generous to other writers. And even from the start, you were very aware that starting with a big book deal was both an incredible like privilege, but also carried with it a lot of burden for expectation. And so I would love to kind of ask, how did it feel to to begin your career with so much already riding on you, like maybe feeling like publisher expectations or reader expectations, because that's a very unique position to be in. And we have known a few other writers who have had that. And sometimes it works out really well because what it means is you have a lot of marketing and publicity behind you. But also sometimes it's too much and you can't control what the market is looking for and the book doesn't sell as well. So how did you feel starting out with that expectation, and then how did it kind of maybe affect your how your career ended up being shaped?
I remember feeling very excited and grateful, but also pretty terrified. Exactly as you described, I was worried the book wouldn't live up to the expectation, that I wouldn't live up to the expectation. Additionally, the book was I had imagined it as a 4-book series, and I had only sold the first book. So a lot was writing on An Ember in the Ashes doing well, like the rest of my career, right? Like I think that if it was something where I had sold 3 books, I knew like, okay, these are under contract, I can write these, I would have felt a little bit more secure. But I really felt like this book has to do well, otherwise I don't get to keep writing. Um, and that was a gamble that I was willing to take in order to get sort of the big support of the house. So my culture and my faith were really helpful in me kind of navigating that time in my life, because there's this sort of cultural belief that you shouldn't like be up on your high horse. You shouldn't be too braggy. You shouldn't be too arrogant. If you have good fortune, that is not because of you. It's because, God has decided to bestow that upon you. And I actually found that very helpful, because it allowed me to kind of set aside my own expectations and just focus on the work and think to myself, I'm going to do the best job possible. I'm going to work really hard. I'm going to hope for the best. And the rest is not in my hands. I just have to, be patient and let this happen. And I have to be true to myself. I have to be true to my story. And I have to take the work that I put into this book, 6 years of work, really 7 by the time it came out, right? Because there was editing that whole 7th year, right? And I have to build on that. This is not automatic. This is something that I have been given a chance, and I can't lose it. I can't mess it up. So that's the mentality I kind of went in with. That's always the mentality I have. I think that it really helps me have something to work toward. If I don't have a goal, if I don't have a goal of, okay, this is going to be the best book I've ever written, or I'm going to do something really weird with this book and really different. If I don't have some type of goal, I feel really lost. So I don't like to sort of rest on my laurels, I guess you can say, because I then am not a functional writer when I'm doing that. If I feel safe, I think it's like an immigrant thing, like an immigrant kid thing. If I feel safe, if I'm like, okay, everything's fine, everything's going great, I start to panic. I'm like, no, 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 I'm missing something. So it's better for me to be focused on the next goal.
I think that
And that's
makes a
kind
lot
of
of
what I did during
sense.
that time.
Yeah, and it also it explains why I think that you are so humble. You don't feel like you deserve any of this success. You're always working towards it. You are always trying to work to deserve what you have created for this career. So on that note, speaking of like, faith, taking that leap, how did you decide in the middle of an incredibly successful fantasy series to then write something completely different? Because you wrote All My Rage, which is then what eventually led to the National Book Award, the Printz Award, and really elevated your career. But you didn't know that at the time. It was actually really risky to say, you know what? I'm doing this one thing that everyone knows me for, but I'm going to completely pivot.
Yeah. So real quick, I just want to make a small amendment, which is that I do feel deserving of what has happened. I don't feel like I don't deserve it. It's more that I feel like one continues to work to deserve the gifts they've been given. So it's sort of like a
Mm-hmm.
constant conversation or a constant process. So just wanted to make that clear. Is
Yeah,
like
no, I think
I
that's
do think it's
wonderful.
important for writers to have a strong sense of self-esteem,
Mm-hmm.
and to be proud of the things that they've accomplished. Like I tell fellow writers all the time, like, yes, absolutely be proud of what you've done, but always remember that now it's the next step. Like take a moment to soak it in and to be happy and to be joyful, and then don't get too caught up in that place. Don't let it get to your head. Then keep moving forward. So just a point of clarity. But in terms of the pivot, it was almost unwilling. I guess it was like I was forced to.
Mm-hmm.
um, I was at the time, I had been working on All My Rage, a version of All My Rage for years. I mean, I had just thrown all my anger into this one document, into notebooks, I just had like stacks of just stuff in my head about growing up in the Mojave Desert at this motel. And when 2016, 2017 rolled around, 2016, I started working on a Reaper at the Gates. I was still working on All My Rage. It wasn't called that at the time. It was called Burn It Down at the time. I was still working on that in the background. And then, you know, Reaper, I worked on it all through 2017, and it ended up coming out in 2018. But I remember feeling very finished with fantasy around 2016, 2017. I was just like, oh my gosh, like I've written two books. Like I don't know how I'm supposed to write Reaper. I got through it, but after I was done with it, I really just wanted to not think about it. Along the same time period, somebody in my life overdosed on fentanyl. Somebody else in my life used a dirty needle and got very severe sepsis that left her in a coma for 3 months.
Oh my gosh.
And these are not people who, these are people who I cared about. And to to see them go through that experience was very sobering and really made me think about the way we talk about drugs and addictions in the broader American community, but also in my community specifically, which is like the Pakistani Muslim community or the South Asian Muslim community. And I wanted to address that in All My Rage, because that was part of my life growing up too. I knew people with addictions. I was around people with addictions. And I wanted to be able to write about that. So all that kind of came together, and I started really, really focusing on the book after I had cleared a Reaper at the Gates, and I did not want to work on the fourth book. I was just like, oh, I don't want to think about it. So it was really through 2018 that I did a lot of work on All My Rage. And then in 2019, before I ever wrote Skye, which is my fourth book in the Ember series, I sold All My Rage. But I knew, and I was told by the publisher, hey, we really think this should come out after you're finished with your series. So then I went and wrote A Skye Beyond the Storm. And I do think that was a good decision on their part to sort of split these up. And they were already taking a risk by buying All My Rage, by acquiring it, and then they took an even greater risk by supporting it the way they did, because Penguin did really support the book. But it was a book that came out kind of toward the end of the pandemic. So I think it still ended up having some of that, the residual like pandemic struggles, as a lot of books did that came out during the pandemic, especially ones that weren't particularly happy. Even though it was a hopeful book, it was not necessarily a happy book. And so I think for because of that, it ended up being a book that took its time to gain steam. So when it first came out, it hit the New York Times bestseller list, which was great. And that was a lot of my previous readers having faith in me. And then, I think it fell off, and it kind of had a very quiet life for a while. And then the awards started happening, and then that changed the trajectory of the book and my life, actually.
Yes.
So it was a huge risk, but these characters were in my head, and they would not shut up. Like, I could not write Skye because these characters, Noor, Salahuddin, and Misbah, they would not stop talking. And I was like, oh my God, please. Like, and every time I would try to work on Skye, they would intrude and be like, what about us? And so eventually I talked to my agent. I said, I think I got to write this thing. She read the first 6 chapters, came back to me and said, go write it. I'm going to deal with everything else. Go do it. So great credit to her also for having faith in me. She was the first person, other than, within my own family, she was the first person outside, basically my husband, who said, I believe in you, go do this.
And she's always been a great defender for you in your career whenever there have been like deadlines, that needed to be pushed. You've been very hilariously open about you and deadlines on social media. And I remember like feeling so much respect for your agent because she always has your best interests in mind. So I love that she went up to bat for you for this book. Did any of your old journal entries play into the writing of All My Rage?
Yeah, a lot of them did. Just thinking about, I still remember there was something I had written. I don't remember, I don't have the book with me, but there's something I had written, I mean, 10 years, like 12 years before. So it was probably back in 2006, 2007. And that came back, that whole section came back, and I put it in the book as is, did very few edits on it. There are multiple sections like that. I mean, there was one entire section from the perspective of the character Mispa about a person who comes to stay at the motel and who steals everything. I had written that in, again, 2005, 2006, I mean, years before.
And how did you decide how much of yourself to put into the story? How much of, as you were talking about, the people that you knew who suffered or unfortunately passed away from drugs, how much of those real stories to put in, and then how much to make fiction?
That's one of those questions that it's hard to answer, because I feel like that's between me and God. Like, what in the book is based off of real true things, and what is stuff that I imagined. I mean, all of it's all fiction, of course, but what is, I guess, inspired really powerfully by things that actually happened, and what is not, that is for me to know.
I think that's a great answer. And
And
I
everyone
think
else to wonder.
in some, no matter what you're writing, whether it's fantasy or contemporary, like there's always pieces of you as an author that get put into the book, whether you're even aware of it or not. I feel, and that's what makes your writing uniquely you. So, okay, I want to talk about, you mentioned that obviously the National Book Award, the Printz Award, has changed your career, and how has that new level of success and recognition, what has it done like for you, and maybe even what additional responsibility do you think that it has brought upon you?
I don't know about responsibility. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about that one a bit. But in terms of how it has helped, um, I think it's brought my old books, the Ember series, to a lot of readers. I think folks who write off young adult fantasy, which you and I both have experience in, all of a sudden have looked at that series again and read it and thought, oh, um, this is actually quite deep. This series has a lot in it that's sort of beyond what I thought. I think many young adult fantasy series have that. I think many young adult fantasy series are some of the best books out there. However, that was very beneficial for me. I also think that it got my books into many more libraries. It got All My Rage into many more hands. It sort of allowed this very strange niche story that does have universal themes, but that is like really weirdly specific, right? It's like brown kids growing up in the Mojave Desert, right? Um, it took that story and it gave it to a lot of people who might have needed it and who didn't know they needed it until they read it. And I've heard from so many of those folks, through DMs, through emails, through, physical letters saying, even sometimes they'll come to tour events and they'll just slide me a letter, and their heart is in that letter. What they've survived is in that letter. And that has changed the way I think about my own writing and what I'm capable of. It has allowed me to sit more with the fact that the book was very difficult to write, but that it was worth the writing. So I would say that it is a lot internal. Externally, it's just sort of getting books into people's hands, and it's a wonderful feeling. And to some degree, it's, I think, people, willing to give my books a chance, whereas maybe they might not have been before. They might have thought, oh, it's just fantasy, or oh, whatever, it's just young adult contemporary. All of a sudden, you have this seal on your book, or these seals on your book, and people are like, oh, maybe I should pay attention to this book. Maybe there's a story there. And then again, people will read it and they didn't expect to feel what they felt. And I get to hear from them, and that's a wonderful experience.
That's amazing. I think being able to connect with readers is such an incredible gift that we have as authors. And you get this reminder now, especially like, receiving these letters from the readers or meeting them on tour, that when you are creating this piece of fiction and it goes out into the world, it's not going into a vacuum. It's actually affecting people, changing lives, changing
Mm.
the way that they maybe even see themselves, which is amazing. Do you think about your readers when
Yeah.
you're writing?
I try not to. I try to just think about the story, the characters, their goals, their motivations, sort of the general themes of the book. I don't want to think about the readers because I want the story to be a pure distillation of the image I have in my head. And I feel like if I think about the readers, that will be altered because I will not be thinking about the characters in front of me, but instead be thinking about what people think of them. It's a little bit reflective of how one maybe should go through life. Of course, there are social rules and mores that we follow because we don't want to, I don't know, disturb the peace by running outside, painted in woad, screaming, right? But not that I haven't thought about that. But but at the same time, if you are only ever thinking about what people will think about you, right? When you make decisions, if what you wear and how you act and who you're friends with and what parties you go to and what events you go to and how you act at those events, if all you're thinking about is what other people think of you, you're not going to be super happy. You're going to be living for others and not for yourself. And so in the same way, I try to sort of pull that into my writing and focus on the story that I want to tell, the instinct that I have, and not maybe what other people are telling me.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. However, on the other side of it, we work with editors. And so I'm actually curious what your relationship is like with your editor, especially since it's developed over the years. Now, your team at Penguin knows you so well. So how does that back and forth go? Do you feel like they trust you more, or do you feel on the flip side that when you have achieved, like awards and bestsellers, do they not push you enough? Because I feel like for me, well, I've had lots of different editors because I've hopped around to different houses, and different editors have different levels of like how much they will edit. And it can be a good thing or a bad.
Yeah, so I had one editor for the Ember books, and I've had one editor for All My Rage and Heir. And I love my editor. Her name is Ruta Rimas, and she's amazing. She's an incredible advocate. She's a very thoughtful editor, um, and she knows me, so she knows when to push. And when I discuss things with her, we sort of go back and forth, and we have a really a positive sort of editorial relationship. I'm also fortunate to have friends who will beta read for me. And I really depend on those friends for those very early reads where I don't feel like the book is ready to go to my editor yet. But at the same time, I need somebody to read it to help me kind of bring it to the draft where it will be ready to go to my editor. So I'm very fortunate to have those friends too. And that is actually a very big part of my editing process, is handing those books to a friend and saying, can you read this? That has been very helpful as well.
Have you had the same like critique partners or beta readers from the very beginning until now, or have you changed throughout your career?
No, I've changed. I've definitely changed. The only constant I would say is my elder brother. He has read everything that I have written since long before Ember, and I generally send him everything very early on.
Okay. I like that. So how long in general does it take for you? Is there a general guideline for how long it takes you to write a book, or does it just vary?
It varies. It can go from 2 years to 15 years. It just depends. I've had a sort of big, adult historical thing in my head for like 3 years now, and I sort of pick at it every now and then and work on it. And it's like I think that'll probably be done 7, 8 years from now.
Yeah.
Just some books take me a long time.
I think the patience though is it's really key because all writers have so many ideas and sometimes they're just not ready yet. I mean, I definitely have ideas that I know they just need time to germinate in the back of my mind, even while I'm working on something else. And I can't control that. So, okay, I have a couple of questions
Truth.
for
Yeah.
you from the Creative Inspired community. So, the first one is from Mesa, and
Okay.
she wants to know, what would your younger self think about your life and career now? And what I love about that is it's kind of the opposite of the questions I think we usually get as authors, which is like the advice that we would give our younger selves. But like, what would, I don't know, let's say 15-year-old Sabaa
I
think?
think she would be delighted. I think she'd be really happy, and she'd be like, "Good job. Like you did it." I'm so, I think she would be very happy, but I think most of all she would be happy that I was able to tell the story of All My Rage. Because I think that at that time she would have never have thought she would be able to tell that story. So I think that's the one I think she'd be the proudest of.
I love that. I love that very much. Okay, and then Trista wants to know, do you have a writing playlist or multiple ones depending on the scene? So do you have like one playlist per book, or are you shifting music? And I know you're a huge music head.
I have one playlist per book, and it is divided up by characters and character relationships. So my playlist will have, it'll be a big list, and then on one side it'll under, I don't know what I've put, I've changed some like setting on iTunes to just have it be the characters. I put their names, and sometimes I put like, for example, I'll put I'm going to use Ember as an example. Actually, I'll use All My Rage as an example. I'll put Salahuddin and Noor, meaning like how Salahuddin feels about Noor, or something he's thinking when he's talking to Noor. And then I might put like Misbah to Salahuddin. So how is this woman thinking about her son? So it's less scenes and more character based, and character relationship based.
And are you developing them as you're writing the book and getting to know your characters? Or do you start out saying, okay, this is the feel, this is the music of this character, and then you write?
No. As I write, I feel it out.
Okay.
That's probably why it takes me so long.
You also used to share your
Sorry.
playlists. Are those still?
I have a sneeze. It's just like lurking. I have them up in some places, but in general now I just throw up music on my Instagram stories when a song occurs to me. Tracking playlists takes a lot of effort, so I do have the All My Rage playlist up on Spotify. I'll probably put the Heir playlist up on Spotify at some point. It's one of those things where I just forget to do it. And I don't, because I don't have time, because I'm writing my books, because I'm so slow.
No, but also I feel like sometimes by the time a book comes out, we as writers, we're doing something else. We're working on something completely different. And so it's hard to remember, oh, I need to put up that playlist or, whatever that inspired the book that is now being published. Okay, speaking of which, tell us about Heir, because that is your next book that's out.
Yeah, so Heir is a young adult fantasy. It takes place in the same world as An Ember in the Ashes, but you don't have to read An Ember in the Ashes to enjoy the book. It is about 20 years set 20 years in the future, and it follows three characters. One is an orphan who is trying to help her people and trying to get vengeance at the same time, and she sort of makes some poor decisions, ends up in prison, and kind of has to figure out which way she's going to go, the way of kind of giving up or the way of determination and potentially making decisions that aren't the best for her mortal soul. And then the next character is Sirsha. She's a tracker, and she just wants to kind of leave tracking behind, takes a job that puts her in a very bad spot, and also might cost her her heart, like both figuratively and literally. And our last character is Quill. He is a prince. He is the connection to the Ember series. So he was the crown prince at the end of the Ember series. He was a baby at that time. Now he's a full-grown adult, and he doesn't want to be emperor. And the story really follows him on that journey as he's trying to figure out, who he is, who he's meant to be for his people, and whether he's willing to fight for them. So, and then of course there's the antagonist, which is this sort of awful killer who is going to cause a lot of problems for all three of these characters.
Excellent.
And it's out on October 1st.
October 1st. I'm looking forward to it. And is this the start of a new series for you?
Duology, yes.
Duology. Excellent. Cool. Okay. So finally, then, where can everyone find you online?
You can find me on TikTok at Sabaa Tahir Author. You can find me on Instagram at Sabaa Tahir and Facebook at Sabaa Tahir, and my website, sabaatahir.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for spending the time with us. I feel like I learned so much, and it was so good to see you again.
It was good to see you too, Evelyn. Thank you so much for having me on.
Want more writing advice and career insight? Join thousands for free at creativeinspiredhappy.com to go behind the scenes with best-selling authors and get access to our book club for writers, creativity challenges, and more. I can't wait to see you there.